Hello and welcome to our bonus video, Goodbye to Fight, Flight, and Freeze. So we talked previously about how when you have unmet needs, you tend to experience a threat or a surge of emotion because our needs are essentially what we need to survive. So if you feel that you can't get enough of something that you need to survive, then that's a threat to your survival. When you feel a threat to your survival, you will have a primitive emotional reaction, a surge of emotion, adrenaline, emotional pain. And that emotion is prompting you to get into action and to do something, anything. It gives you a sense of urgency to get that need met, and that becomes your motivation. It becomes the most important thing in the world to you, is to get your needs met. Well, unfortunately, in today's world, fight, flight, and freeze don't work as well as they used to work in terms of actually getting needs met. Because when we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, typically we have what looks like an emotional overreaction. And anybody around us is not necessarily going to respond well to that emotional reaction. So if you look at these examples of people in fight, flight, or freeze mode, you can see it. So these two guys arguing at work, right? I mean, would anybody actually get into a fight at work and have any kind of a positive result? I mean, even getting into a fight in a bar these days doesn't have a positive result. In fact, in our society, there's probably nowhere where getting into a fight, a physical fight with someone else, gets us a positive result or gets us more of what we need. Fights these days are usually considered breakdowns in communication, breakdowns in productive talk. Now, in the past, thousands of years ago, fights might have actually served a valuable purpose, but these days they don't. And even on a global scale, you'll see that wars are becoming less and less a way that we solve our problems between nations. And you think about flight, right? So flight is, I refuse to talk. I refuse to have a conversation. And that doesn't work very well either. Because if you're trying to work something out with somebody and they go sulk in their room, nothing good happens, right? The person that's trying to have a conversation just gets exasperated and they don't get their needs met. And the person that's sulking in their room just feels horrible and they don't get their needs met either. And then when you think of freeze, and you maybe translate it to our more modern social situations, I think what comes up for me is the person who freezes is the person who acquiesces and who just does what other people tell them to do, or agrees, or doesn't do anything. But regardless, they're not getting their needs met very effectively. One of the things that I teach in a lot of my classes is this model that I call the dynamics of a reaction model. So the reaction model talks about the difference between intention and impact when it comes to behavior. And it basically says that every behavior has an intention and an impact. And we tend to make this error in that we tend to assume that when somebody impacts us negatively with our behavior, that is their actual intention. And then we have a reaction to it. So for example, if someone spills water on us, if we think it's an accident, we don't really have a super negative reaction. I mean, we still have to deal with the wet clothes. But for the most part, we're not too upset about it. But if we think they did it on purpose, then we get upset about it. And that goes for everything that affects us negatively. So if someone has a meeting and doesn't include us, and it makes us feel worried that we're being left out of important decisions in the company, and we think they intended to leave us out, we're going to have a very different reaction than if we believe that they might have just not thought to invite us despite their best intentions, that it was more of an unintentional mistake. So we tend to have emotional reactions when we are impacted negatively by people's behaviors, and we make the mistake of assuming that they intend to impact us negatively with those behaviors, so that person knows how I feel, they know how their behavior impacted me, they intended it, and so then I get upset. Well, what happens is when you have an amygdala hijacking, or you have an emotional reaction to something that triggers you in the workplace, it could be anything that upsets you, and you actually start letting that stress out. So you have an edge in your voice. You have an intensity to the way you're talking to people. Maybe you look frenetically because you're running around with your head cut off. Maybe you raise your voice. Maybe you stomp off and go sulk in your office and close your door. Whatever it is that you do when you're under stress in your office, anybody watching your behavior and experiencing it will have a negative impact. If you think about it, if somebody near you raises their voice or talks with a sarcastic tone of voice or says something that seems to be mean, or they have a lot of intensity or frenetic energy around, usually that's infectious, so it affects you negatively. And if you make the mistake of thinking that they actually intend to affect you negatively, then you're going to feel threatened. And what ends up happening, and I'm not going to go into this model in a lot of detail today, but what ends up happening is people have a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions are that when they're impacted by behavior, the person who exhibited the negative behavior intended that impact. And so what we have are people being stressed out, reacting to something, and then triggering everybody else with their reaction. And it creates this circle of continuous reactions to each other. And this happens a lot in an office environment or in a family when somebody starts getting stressed out and other people start responding to that stress. And sometimes I call it anger bouncing off the walls. I sometimes feel like I can literally feel the anger and the stress bouncing off the walls. It actually feels like energy. And I actually have a theory that it is energy. It's showing up in that energy. And it is actually literally infecting people. But we won't go into more detail than that, other to say that if you go into fight, flight, or freeze mode and you have a reaction, your behavior, I guarantee it, will impact those around you negatively. And if those around you have a good relationship with you and they say, oh, you're just stressed, and they're not affected by it, then good. But chances are everybody's not going to be that way. So somebody else at least is going to be triggered by your behavior, at least one person, perhaps more, and those people then will react. And then their reactions are going to be ugly, and so the other people that see their reactions are going to react. And this is what causes a lot of problems in organizations, a lot of drama. People just call it drama. But essentially what it is people getting stressed out, people being triggered, and then people reacting, and then people reacting and being triggered by other people's reaction. And it's a spiral. It has a negative effect. We call it adding fuel to the fire. So a book came out called Crucial Conversations, bestseller, really great book, and they did an analysis of who the most effective people in organizations were, what they had in common. And what they found out was that the top 1% of the most effective people in organizations share only one thing in common, and that is to facilitate a productive conversation in a high-stakes situation. So when people are stressed out, when they're feeling a lot of emotion, when they're feeling a lot of threat, when they're feeling a lot at stake, these people have the ability to calm everybody down and talk through the issues and get a resolution. So they get everybody calm, they get decisions made, they get things moving. So they're able to diffuse that cycle of people reacting to each other and just getting caught up in unproductive drama. So if we think about how would one want to get their needs met today in today's society, what we want to think about are productive conversations, productive dialogue, which to many of us is somewhat scary. It's hard to maybe speak up if you're afraid that someone, won't accept what you're saying or won't be open to your idea, or maybe you'll look stupid. So this is not an easy thing to do, but in our society, it's the way to get your needs met. And when people resort to fight, flight, or freeze, that usually doesn't work when it comes to getting your needs met. So when we think about your goal in terms of becoming more effective, growing more effective, changing your life, that's one of the reasons why part of what we do is say we need to identify your unmet needs and get them met. Your goal is to have most of your needs met most of the time. So you're not having to deal with that amygdala hijacking. You're not having to deal with those surges of emotions that cause you to feel fight, flight, or freeze, so that you can actually be peaceful, be happy, be confident, be present. And what that allows you to do is actually have the wherewithal to handle conversations in a productive manner instead of going into your own protective modes. Okay, so this is not an easy thing to do, but it's the goal. And more studies in neuroscience say that the prefrontal cortex here, this is the center of our brain that is responsible for language and logic and higher functioning thinking. It has what they call a shutoff valve. So if you're having one of these reactions, where you're having a surge of emotions, your prefrontal cortex can pretty much send a signal and say, hey, calm down, I'm not really being threatened, let's handle this calmly. But it requires, your prefrontal cortex requires tons of calories to be able to work effectively, tons of energy to be able to work effectively. And so what ends up happening is if people are under prolonged stress, even low levels of stress, the prefrontal cortex degrades and it is unable to do its job. So what you tend to see is people losing it, or having an amygdala hijacking, or having uncontrolled emotional reactions when they've been under stress for a long time, or when they're tired, or when they're sick, or when things are going on, because they don't have as much energy to make this prefrontal cortex work as effectively as it could and keep them calm when they're hijacked by their emotional reactions or their unmet needs. So the bottom line is that if we can get you to a point where most of the time you have all your needs met, you're not going to have to deal with this in the first place. You're not going to have to spend so much of the energy of your brain dealing with pushing down fight, flight, or freeze, because you're not going to have to control it with this part of the brain because you're not going to have it as much. And then when it does happen, it'll be much easier to control. So that is our goal. And again, I'm going to go back to the trigger log, which is the basis of this program, and say, why are we keeping a trigger log? We're keeping a trigger log because what we're doing is we're creating your unique map, what it is that goes on in your brain, and what are the patterns that trigger you? Because we all have different things that tend to trigger us. And I'll go into why that is in later videos. For now, keep up on that trigger log.